So we're going to transition now to our second keynote for the conference. And so I'd like to introduce Anna Marotra. Now, Anna is an engineer. She's an environmental engineer, but she has a lot of experience both in wastewater as a wastewater specialist and as a researcher. She's currently the director for the Wastewater Environment Federation's Wastewater Surveillance Program. So she's been involved nationally with the utilities and the community of practice and what they need to do. She's been a key partner with CDC's National Wastewater Surveillance System. And just as a note, she's a Berkeley, she got her PhD from UC Berkeley, and I don't know how long you've been with WEF. How long have you been with?
2 years, almost 2 years.
2 years she's been with WEF, so that's great. And I think she's going to tell us all about what's going on with the professional organization and the utilities of practice. So Anna, thank you so much for joining us here in Michigan.
Well, thank you all for sticking around, and thank you for this opportunity. This is really fun for me to be in Michigan with you all, and Michigan has a special place in my heart for a couple of reasons. One, even though I've never lived here, my family's all from here, both sides of the family. I have ancestors who mined iron and logged pine in the Upper Peninsula. I have a great-grandpa who ran for mayor of Ann Arbor. He lost. And my mom was a first-generation student here at MSU and graduated in the 60s. I'm also really excited that I got to meet for the first time today Irene Zagoraraki, who I worked with very briefly pre-WEF when I was at CDM Smith on the very early, program detecting SARS-CoV-2 in Detroit wastewater. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, Irene, it's April 2020. We got to get going because Gertrude Medema, he already found it in wastewater back in February, right? And now looking back, it's sort of like, wow, there's no difference between April and February 2020, and we've come so far. So, as Joan mentioned, I'm now at the Water Environment Federation. If you're not familiar with us, we go by WEF. We're a not-for-profit training and education membership organization, and our members are about 30,000 folks in the wastewater sector. So that's operators, regulators, academics, engineers. And you might know some of the things we do. One of the things we're most known for is WEFTech, which is our pretty large annual conference. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's coming up at WEFTech in terms of wastewater surveillance. There's also a one-day wastewater disease surveillance summit that we're running the day before WEFTech. So very much kind of like what you all are talking about here today. So don't worry, I will let you know about that. But we do a whole bunch of other stuff at WEF. And one of the things that we do is the wastewater surveillance program, which is wholly funded by the CDC through a 5-year cooperative agreement, and we are literally smack dab in the middle of that cooperative agreement, so we've got a couple years left. And we work really closely with the news team to figure out, what can we do to support utilities who are a really important stakeholder group in wastewater surveillance programs. They're not the only stakeholder group, right? We've heard so many great lessons learned today about bringing teams, interdisciplinary cross-sector teams together, epidemiologists, laboratorians, academics, the public, right? But the wastewater sector is the sector that I represent, so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And I've promised to talk about and let me just explain where I'm getting the information I'm sharing with you today. It's sort of a qualitative, anecdotal look back on the last year and a half of running the National Utilities Community of Practice. So you might hear tomorrow, you're going to hear from John Person tomorrow from the CDC, and he might talk a little bit about these communities of practice that the CDC has set up to support implementation of news. There are 3 of them. Health departments, that's hosted by the CDC, laboratories, that's hosted by the Association of Public Health Laboratories, and then utilities. And the idea is that's kind of capturing the 3 key stakeholder groups. Again, not everybody, but the key stakeholder groups. And let's see, clicker. And so we laid the groundwork for this COP for a long time, and we finally got going in earnest in February 2022. And we are at over 300 members now. We almost have all the states covered, except for a few that are just the lightest states shown in the map that you can probably squint and see on the screen. And the idea is that this is literally a community of practice. A group of practitioners all interested in wastewater surveillance, in the, they're utility professionals, interested in it, participating in it, curious about it, worried about where it's going. And we get together and we provide a forum in which to share lessons learned, exchange information. We get resources. WEF develops resources, peer-reviewed information for our community. So this is really what I'm going to be speaking from today. I should make I should explain that we are also, so the breakout session, by the way, this has been an awesome day. I just have to say, I love the poster teasers. I definitely am going to adopt that for a future summit. And I love the breakout session, which was all about barriers that utilities face to participation. We are running larger scale versions of that breakout session at places all around the country this year. And, Kelly attended one of them. And so we are really digging deep into what are the barriers that utilities face. So just kind of that breakout session that we had earlier, writ large. So we're going to do a more systematic sort of study of those barriers. I'm just talking about sort of anecdotal stuff today. Okay, so opportunities and challenges. That's what I'm on the agenda for. I'm going to flip it. I'm going to talk about the harder stuff first, challenges, then opportunities. And before I get into challenges, I thought it would be helpful to talk about is there a typical wastewater treatment plant that participates in wastewater surveillance? Yeah, of course not. It's a very diverse group out there. But sort of statistically speaking, if you were to think of a typical wastewater treatment plant, and this is a treatment plant, a given utility might have multiple treatment plants, right? So I'm talking treatment plant level. Participating in wastewater surveillance in the U.S., it can be located in any one of the 50 states or Puerto Rico or Guam, but chances are good that it's going to be in one of 11 states, including Michigan, and I'll show you the 10 others. Those are just the ones that have the most sampling locations, the biggest programs. Do you guys have, I can just take this off. Perfect. Okay, much better. This typical treatment plant will be taking samples at the influent rather than sampling upstream, although I will say the Michigan program is does more upstream sampling, I think, than most. But again, typical treatment plant we're talking about. And here's the key thing. This typical treatment plant serves larger populations than the average or the median population served by all treatment plants. So does anybody want to shout out how many treatment plants there are in the U.S.? Does anybody know? Is it 5,000? Do I have any votes for 5,000? 10,000? 15,000? Yeah, it's 15,000. And the median population served by those plants is on the order of a couple thousand people. So the vast majority of treatment plants in this country are small. They have a flow less than 1 MGD, probably less than 0.1 MGD on average. So I just wanted to kind of paint this picture of the typical wastewater treatment plant. And I wanted to back that up with a little bit of data. Again, this isn't some rigorous analysis. If we look at the national scale, these data were current as of January. I know things have evolved, but the story is probably still the same. As of January, there were a little over 1,200 sites with current data on COVID data tracker. This is just for SARS-CoV-2. You all know that you can get Mpox data online now, too, for news. 98% of those were sites at wastewater treatment plants versus upstream. And the median population served by those plants on news was 34,000 versus 2,000 for all U.S. treatment plants. So again, that's just data kind of underlining this thing that, these are large plants. Okay, I know you're probably saying, yeah, this is a completely biased analysis because news doesn't capture all treatments, all sites being sampled. Yes, totally agree. And news data aren't available for sites that have fewer than 3,000 people. So right then and there, you're biasing your analysis. I would argue, though, that the sites that have fewer than 3,000 people, chances are good. They might be treatment plants, but they might also be upstream sampling locations at large utilities with large treatment plants. So I think it might come out in the wash. But one day, I will look at that more carefully. And this and then if we kind of drill down into those state level programs, these are data that tell the same story for those 11 states I mentioned, Michigan being one of them. The other states are California, Colorado, Missouri, Nebraska, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Oregon, Utah, and Wisconsin. So again, these states combined represent the majority of sampling locations for news. And it's the same story. There are about 600 treatment plants in these 11 states being monitored for public health monitoring out of more than 4,000. And but those 600 plus or minus treatment plants represent a majority of the population, 69% of the population in those 11 states. Okay, this makes a lot of sense. This is not anything that's, groundbreaking, right? Because if you are Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and you want to expand your program, you might be thinking you want to kind of capture the most folks in Michigan possible. You maximize the number of people you're capturing in your sample set, but minimize the number of samples you have to take. So you're going to hit the bigger treatment plants. But why does this matter? What matters is because we're talking a lot about expanding wastewater surveillance, getting into rural areas, capturing as many of those, 80% of the population that's connected to the sewer as possible. When we start to do that, we're going to start to kind of talk about treatment plants that are smaller and smaller, and we're going to really have to think about different challenges. We're going to be partnering with different utilities than we have been partnering with so far. Okay. You guys still with me? All right, so let's talk about challenges, and I promise I will talk about opportunities. And I like to break down the challenges into kind of two categories. Challenges faced by utilities who are not currently participating in a program, but are maybe wastewater surveillance, curious about it, right? And then challenges faced by utilities that are currently participating. All right, so those that are not participating, and I literally heard almost this verbatim upstairs in the breakout group, not knowing where to start or who to contact. So oftentimes a utility might have a relationship with their local health department. If they do, it's probably with the environmental health section of that local health department. This was a laboratory director at a Maryland utility who said, I spoke with our local health department because they were interested in participating in wastewater surveillance, but they did not have any knowledge of the program. So they just stopped. They reached a dead end, and that was it. Second challenge for those not participating, this is a very common reason why they'll drop out, or they just will say no thank you from the outset. Not having enough resources. So those are human resources, non-human resources. Yesterday in one of our workshops, we really talked a lot about how long does it really take you, wastewater utility operator or lab person, to participate in this program, right? How long does it take to collect the sample, package the sample, maybe get the sample to its FedEx drop-off location if you're doing that. But more than that, how long does it take for you to track down the flow data that you need to submit? And then are you spending time communicating these data to your local elected officials? There are a lot of utilities that do that will package up the data, send out a weekly email. Are you answering questions from the public or school districts or whomever? And so we came up with a wide range of time of an estimate, anywhere from 30 minutes per sampling event, if you're literally just putting it in a box, sticking it by the front door, and saying goodbye to the sample, up to 2 hours. Well, actually, the highest was 4 hours a week, because this person was driving this sample an hour each way to drop it off, and she was doing that twice a week. So 30 minutes once or twice a week, maybe not a big deal. 4 hours, that's starting to eat into your, time that you need to be spending on other things. And this was an operator that we had invited to one of our workshops, and he's like, yeah, that's the day I do quarterly sampling, and I gotta be doing the quarterly sampling because I'm the only licensed operator that can collect the samples. So thank you for inviting me, but I really can't make it. And that's really common at a lot of small treatment plants. There's one licensed operator who has to do everything. Okay, here's a big one, not being able to convince leadership. So that's utility leadership or elected officials or community leaders of the value in participating. This was somebody in South Dakota who said, and this was something said actually last fall. I mean, now this really holds, right? The public health emergency is over. COVID is over, definitely, right? No one is getting COVID anymore, right? And so it doesn't make sense for us to use resources for this. And this just reflects sort of a lack of awareness, and sort of we're not doing a good job of educating folks on what else this is good for. Scabies, right? I mean, who knew, right? So this is not seeing the value in it. Okay, so those are utilities. Those are reasons that we see utilities saying, nope, we're not doing this anymore, or nope, we're not doing it at all. And this is what utilities who are participating in programs, this is kind of what they face. So they might be trucking along with a particular program, and then they get contacted by Wastewater Scan, for example. And they're like, okay, wait, Wastewater Scan is offering me a stipend. I don't get a stipend right now, but where does the Wastewater Scan data go? Does that get shared with news? And like, how does this all work? And how long, right? They don't, it's still a little bit of the Wild West out there. I think things are settling down quite a bit, but just understanding, how things all fit together. This is a very common email I get from a utility. It starts with, do you know anything about? Do you know anything about, what news is doing? Do you know anything about, this other program or what? So again, I think we could do a better job of sort of explaining that. I touched on this earlier, that there are, believe it or not, more superintendents out there who are packaging up the data, interpreting the data, adding little missives that go out with the data sets to their local stakeholder group. And so they're doing that data interpretation themselves. And that stakeholder group has started to rely on them to do that data interpretation. And so that's, a good amount of time for them each week. They might enjoy it, but again, it's time required to do it. And also, they don't always know the best way to interpret the wastewater data. I think a lot of us don't. And then communicating data to the public. There are many utilities out there that put the data right up on their dashboard. And this was a quote from somebody from Hampton Roads Sanitation District in southeastern Virginia, who they have a dashboard and they put their data up there, and they will get a phone call from somebody from the public saying, hey, you haven't updated your dashboard in 2 days. What's going on, right? So it's just another thing to add to kind of their list. Again, they like sharing these data. They like sort of being part of pushing this science forward, pushing the practice of this forward. But it's just a challenge, right? We already touched on this a little bit, addressing questions about long-term funding. So we were talking earlier about kind of the sense is, as long as these programs are funded, and as long as it's really kind of at the end of 30 minutes to an hour a week of an operator's time, I think there is a willingness to continue to participate. But once the funding is gone, meaning funding for the sample kits, funding for the analyses, maybe funding for a courier, funding for the shipping, if that goes away, then participation will drop. And so there's also sort of this anticipatory concern about the funding going away and committing to something long-term. The other thing I would add to here that I didn't originally include but has come up over and over in our workshops is this idea, and one of the operators yesterday in the workshop said it perfectly. We are worried that we are collecting evidence against ourselves. So, 1,4-dioxane, that's an example of a pollutant that EPA was put on some permits just as a monitor only, and before you know it, the treatment plant will have a 1,4-dioxane permit limit in their NPDES permit. And so, even if that's never the intention, that a wastewater surveillance marker, pathogen target, will be put on as an effluent parameter on a permit, right? I mean, we say that's silly, that's not going to happen. It is only natural that a treatment plant will worry about that because they have experience with that. And what they're going through with PFAS right now, only heightens that concern. Okay, and this one I think is also a big one. So managing concerns about archived samples being tested without the utility's knowledge. So we heard the case of polio earlier. We talked a little bit about that, right? Polio is tricky. Polio is the trickiest of the ones to include in a surveillance program because It is a disease that's earmarked for global eradication. And so there are all sorts of containment requirements around samples that could potentially contain what's called polio infectious material. If you are a wastewater treatment plant in a geographic region that has positive clinical cases for polio, you are suspected to have polio in your influent. That influent then falls, and if you're going to store any of those samples, influent or primary sludge, for more than 6 months, then now you need to be reporting that to the National Authority for Containment of Poliovirus, the NAC. So it just layers in this whole, level of responsibility that, and there's some requirements in there for, again, if you're only holding the samples for more than 6 months, you need to kind of separate them from the non-polio containing materials, but you're really not clear what those are, and you need to use different shell. It gets complicated. And I was on a phone call with a utility and an academic, not in Michigan. And we were talking about other things, and then polio came up, and the academic said, oh yeah, we've looked for polio in your influent. And they did not tell the utility that. And the utility said, I really hope you didn't find polio. No, we did not find polio. But that's the kind of thing that utilities are worried about, right? That somewhere along the line, some archive sample is going to be analyzed for something, and they're not going to know about it, but then they're going to be liable for it. Okay, that's all the not so fun stuff. Let's talk about the opportunities. I was in a call last week with Rhode Island, the Department of Environmental Management and the Department of Health, and they had a whole bunch of utility operators in the room. And one of the operators spoke up, and it's sort of like we're at this watershed moment, right? The public health emergency is over. There is still funding for these programs, but there's not as much excitement about doing, wastewater surveillance and participating in this. But one of the operators spoke up and said, guys, because it was all guys, you understand, this is not going away. News got started in September of 2020, and it's still going strong. Here we are having a couple hundred people in a room talking about this. This is not going away. Guys, this is an opportunity to be part of something at the beginning of something that's going to get really big, right? And people are like, oh yeah, maybe you have a point. But that is the mission of wastewater treatment of utilities, is to protect public health and environmental health. So we actually asked our COP meeting, this was a year ago, is protecting public health and or the environment part of your utility's mission statement? Some people weren't sure, but none of the respondents said yes, but only the environment part. It was either yes, just public health, or yes, both public health and the environment. I realized that the y-axis labels got cut off there, but that third one down with the biggest bar is yes, it is, and it's both public health and the environment. So this is part of the mission. It's about protecting public health by, preventing release of pathogens into the environment, but now it's also about generating information to protect public health. Also an opportunity to engage with the public. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure between 2016 and 2019 there was not as much coverage of poop and sewage in the media as there has been from 2020 to 2023, right? It's in the New York Times, it's in The Economist, it's all over the place about how great, this whole idea of looking for information in sewages. And so it does, this was somebody from an Oklahoma utility, says it brings great awareness to the importance of our wastewater collection and treatment systems. These are always on responders. These are 24-hour responders, people who keep our drinking water clean at the cleaner end and our water bodies clean at the other end. And this is by far my favorite quote about wastewater in COVID from a local hospital CMO. I love looking at the wastewater data, said no one prior to the COVID pandemic, but here we are. I don't know, does anybody else go obsessively to their local dashboard? I go to my local utilities, website, they post the data. The city of Boston, which is my neighboring city, they've got some sub-sewer shed sampling going on. They do a really nice job of plotting the neighborhood data versus the overall Eastern Massachusetts data versus overall national data. It's really cool what they do. I, of course, go to COVID Data Tracker on a regular basis. So that's a huge opportunity. And, just even getting people in to take tours of wastewater treatment plants. That's something we incorporate into our workshops. And so yesterday we had a whole gaggle of graduate students and health department people who had never stepped foot inside a wastewater treatment plant. And they're like, dang, this is really interesting what goes on here. And I couldn't agree more. Expanding collaborations. So this is also an opportunity, right? Chances are, so the options on the y-axis are local health departments are at the top, state health departments, and then the other three you can read. But this was a question of who are you participating with for your wastewater surveillance activities? This is an optional question when people enroll in our community of practice. I would say before all of this, chances are very good that a utility was not regularly interacting with their state health department. State environmental agency, absolutely. Maybe the local health department with pre-treatment issues and the like, but and certainly academics. There's been a lot of good relationships for a long time between academics and wastewater treatment plants. But that's another opportunity. And here's one that I really like. This is the last one I'll leave you with, is informing potable reuse. So this was a great paper by Dan Garrity, who is one of our, he helps advise our COP. And he's just a great thinker and has been a real leader in all of this in Southern Nevada. He actually works for a water utility, Southern Nevada Water District, but he does a lot of wastewater research. And they had a great paper looking at dynamics of pathogens in influent wastewater and how that can inform process optimization, operation of water reuse systems. So you can, care about what's coming in and how you're going to treat that so that you can reuse the water. So I thought that was great. Okay, I promised I would share a little bit of information. Again, you probably, if you know WEF at all, it's probably because of WEF Tech, which is the event on the right-hand side. So just a little plug for that. It is a 3-day event happening in Chicago. It starts on October 2nd, that's a Monday, goes through the 4th. The other days are like workshops and stuff. If you want to attend and you work for a health department, you can attend WEF Tech for a deeply discounted rate. So ask me about that, and I can give you a code. You can also attend WEF Tech just for $150 and just go to the exhibit hall. And if you're a WEF member, it's cheaper, whatever. That WEF Tech is really only in person. We're not going to have any sort of virtual components, but it focuses on everything related to wastewater. All the steps in collections, treatment from preliminary through tertiary treatment. We have an operations challenge, and there's just a lot of fun stuff to do. The thing on the left is a Wastewater Disease Surveillance Summit. So this is a 1-day event. There were a lot of you that were at our first Wastewater Disease Surveillance Summit in Cincinnati last March. So this is just the second annual version of that. It's going to also be in Chicago. It's only 1 day. It's totally free to attend. You can attend it in person or online. I put the link to the website. Registration is imminent for that. This is all about wastewater surveillance and everything that you're talking about today. So it's 100% relevant to health departments, utilities, whoever. So that's just what I wanted to leave you with. I also wanted to leave you with this QR code if there are any utilities in the audience. I know there are some of you who are not members of our community of practice. Please consider joining. And if you have any questions about the work that WEF is doing in wastewater surveillance, the communities of practice, we also run a free auto sampler and flow meter program. Just please don't hesitate to reach out. And I want to thank you for your attention on this. What day are we on? Wednesday afternoon.
Hi, this is Dolly from Grand Valley State University. So, talking about retroactive sampling on that stuff, do you have any guidelines or things when we think of, because getting samples pre-pandemic was like a gold mine for us to look at those things. And in science, we want to have stuff to be able to look at future stuff, things that we don't know we can do. So how can we better work with our utility partners to get that going?
Open lines of communication. I think the key clause in that statement was without the utilities' knowledge, right? And I think that's what they're worried about. So having clear data use agreements or just clear communication about, or expectations about, before we go look for X, we'll talk to you about it.
They don't want legal reprisal for having something in their water system that they maybe didn't know about, like the polio that you were giving an example about. Yeah. Is there any legislation that they're proposing at least to protect them, kind of like someone's hurt on the side of the road and you help them, that they have legislation that you can't really get in trouble for that? Is there, are they trying to do that so that we could get in the future more help from utility companies because they are protected?
That's a great question. I've never heard it framed as legislation, so maybe that is something to think about. What I think would, in speaking with utilities, what kind of would assuage their concerns is even just a strongly worded letter from EPA or statement from EPA saying this will never in no way, shape, or form be linked to generation of NPDES permit limits. So that is something that we have requested from EPA, and we'll just see how that goes. In the meantime, we're going to come out with a statement on that. But legislation I have not heard of. I will think of that. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Hi, Krista Wigginton, University of Michigan. I have a question about utilities and the ability to be reimbursed for their time, like with monetary. And I understand that some states that's possible and other states that's not. Can you speak to why that's the case? And is there, in the future, will we be able to reimburse them for their efforts?
Oh, yeah, thank you for asking that. And I wish I knew the answer to that. And one of my colleagues is here, Jenny. Jenny, we need to put that on our list to figure out what the heck is going on. Because I just heard in the UP, the panel, Sarah said that she is reimbursing utilities. Wyoming did it. Missouri does it. There are many states that can do it. There are other ways, though, to support utilities besides cold, hard cash, although that's always welcome. Buying supplies, buying equipment, even if it's not a piece of equipment that's directly related to wastewater surveillance. Also, West Virginia is trying to get their licensed operators CEU credits for participating in a program like this. That goes a long way to helping them out. There was another one that popped into my head, and if I think of it, I'll let you know. But yes, thank you for reminding me that we really need to get to the bottom of that. Because Wisconsin's one that wanted to, couldn't. New York can't. It really is state dependent, like everything, right? Yeah, thank you for asking that. Hi, Irene.
Thank you, Anna, for your amazing work. Remember the beginning of the pandemic, you were still in Australia,
yes.
and we're trying to figure out what to do. And now this is where we are now. Incredible. Amazing. So I was going to ask you, is the Water Research Foundation working directly with CDC to think about the next pathogen or mechanisms for supporting utilities in the future?
You're queuing up John's talk really well. So he's going to speak to that tomorrow. He's giving you a big thumbs up, Irene. He's going to speak to the whole process that News is using to figure out the next pathogen and how they're going to be rolling out that sort of multi-pathogen panel through the end of the year. So no, we're not really supporting them on that other than communicating that out and getting feedback on it. But yeah, come back tomorrow for John's talk.
My question, and thank you, Anna, again, is really about that future aspect as well. And part of it is, how much do you think we will need to go into the sewer shed beyond the wastewater treatment plant? And then secondly, I think Goodson brought up, these other issues, opioid and drug use, and how much of that is sort of a barrier, as opposed to infectious disease monitoring for community, wastewater utilities to get involved.
Yeah, both great questions. And so speaking, with the utility lens, upstream sampling requires, infinitely more labor to execute on that, and more equipment that's prone to failure is more challenging to fix in the field. Clogged intake tubing, batteries that fail. If you're talking about composite samples, if you're talking about passive sampling, you can lose your tampon in the flow. It can jump out of the flow and be dry when you go pick it up. All sorts of things that you can't really monitor like you can at the treatment plant. So I would say that I spoke with somebody at the Calgary, City of Calgary Hungary treatment plant who said, no problem collecting samples at our 3 influence, no problem whatsoever. But you guys want to keep us doing the upstream sampling, you're going to have to hire a couple more people because it is just really challenging. And then you asked about drugs. Yeah, drugs for some reason is a sensitive subject. And I think it's because that there is this potential for law enforcement involvement. And until we get really clear about that line, what that line is and when you can cross that line between public health and law enforcement, it's certainly done in other countries. Australia's drug monitoring program, my understanding is it works more closely with law enforcement. But yes, that is a sensitive subject for utilities for sure. Okay, thank you again for your attention.